the cloud. We are recording now.
Great. All right, welcome to the SIG Auth meeting for Wednesday, April 18th. We'll go ahead and jump into the announcements. So Tim, I think you're first. And I don't hear Tim. Tim is going to be at KubeCon in Europe. And so this is a draft for SIG Auth updates. If you want to take a look, leave comments. The idea is to give a summary of what's going on in SIG, what's planned short term, and just try to communicate face-to-face with people who are at the meetups there. Maybe I should have waited for Tim to make this announcement. Anyway.
Sorry, do you need me to add anything?
Not unless you want to. I'm going to assume that was everything you wanted to say.
I didn't actually catch what you said, but I was just looking to get input on if there's anything else that I missed that people wanted to kind of call out in this forum where leads from a lot of the SIGs will be there.
Okay. Great. One other announcement, not specific to SIG Auth, but you may have seen some of the announcement emails around the release timeframes and what they're trying to do with code freeze. If tests are green, they're going to let code freeze be shorter. So they are pushing, SIG release is pushing on tests that are failing, blocking, and trying to get SIGs to fix those up to minimize the amount of time that we're in code freeze. SIG Auth doesn't have any failing tests that I'm aware of. We weren't in the list, the initial list that got sent out, but if you do see those, any show up for SIG Auth, please jump on those or route them to the right people so we can not block the release train. All right, that is all the announcements that I had. Nobody had put new pulls in the list to discuss this week. Some of the ones noted in previous releases or previous meetings are still ongoing, especially some of the stuff around token request and the client Go exec. So if you are interested in those, I expect review to be picking up and those to start nearing completion. So if you take a look at previous meeting minutes, you can find some of those if you're interested. All right, and with that, I wanted to hand it over to discussion of security profiles. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and you can share your screen.
Hi everyone. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thanks. Okay, let me describe what the security profile is. So first, the security profile is designed to solve basically two major problems. The first one is the difficulty managing a Kubernetes cluster to be secure, including setting up the command line flag correctly. And it also requires class admin a certain level of knowledge about the security. And currently, there's no way to automatically provision namespaces with the objects when a new namespace is created. So in the world, people are doing actual efforts building in-house solutions, but because of lack of the common standard solutions, so these efforts are very difficult to be reused or shared across the community. So just like people find from internet, there's a bunch of different kinds of solutions regarding the security of a Kubernetes cluster. So what the proposal is trying to bring a very easy user experience when you start a cluster. Just specify the name of a security profile, which includes a bunch of settings to make sure the cluster is created and meet the certain security requirements for a specific user scenario. And this solution also works with configured code systems where all the configurations are expressed in YAML files and committed into code repo. Security profiles can also be integrated into the code repo and go through the CI/CD pipeline the code configure system usually use. So what is it? It's basically a microsystem defines created settings of a cluster, including bootstrapping configurations like command line flags and cluster scope policy objects, for example, the policy security policy, and also the policy objects to be populated into namespaces, including network policy, and basically simplify the cluster administration. You just select a security profile name without knowing a lot of details. And the security profile itself will be highly portable and customizable, also can be extended. So it's also well versioned to allow seamless upgrade. And the feature won't need any change on the core Kubernetes. We are also thinking of contribute to the Kubernetes conformance test to help providing a tool validate a Kubernetes cluster has met the security requirements. So in general, it includes like 3 parts: the bootstrapping tool rules, which define command line flags. So the deploy tool like Cluster API or KubeADM will take care of that. And cluster scope policy objects is defined, and that can be simply created into the cluster using kubectl or add-on manager. And the namespace scope policy objects, which is populated to a namespace when it gets created automatically. So we need additional controllers to help populate these objects. So there's another bucket about the conformance test, which can be used to validate a cluster whether it meets the security requirements. So it's not something, we are not developing something new features. We are not defining new policies. And we don't make any change to core Kubernetes. And the security profile is designed for the common generic use case. So we don't cover the particular use case like specific resource quota or cluster role bindings particular to a user environment. And it's not a template system. It doesn't do template rendering or string substitution. It's not a policy engine. So this is an example of security profile. So you define, so on the left bottom, we define a security profile, which has 1 runtime rules, and it references a namespace template. And in the namespace template, we define the network policy and a role or role bindings using a policy security policy. And these objects will be automatically populated into a namespace when it gets created. And on left side, it's policy security policy. It's basically a cluster scope policy. It will be automatically installed when together with the security profile on cluster level, and can be used by any namespace later. It also includes another section called the Bootstrapping Rules. It defines how to set up the command line flags for different components, mostly for API servers, and some flags for Kubernetes and also control manager. So we expect the cluster lifecycle manager to respect these settings and override their own settings. And these settings are only enforced during the cluster bootstrapping. So because when a cluster is running, it's difficult to monitor or inspect these settings from a control running inside the cluster. It's possible we can install multiple security profiles into a cluster, but we only allow 1 security profile to be enforced at a time. So we introduced the concept of a security profile selector, which is a custom resource. It only selects the name of the security profile, and the running controllers will basically be aware of which security profile is effective and enforce that. There will be a status for each of security profile, and the status will reflect the rules, whether that's going to be enforced or not, or is still in progress, and any errors happens during the enforcement. So on the left bottom, there's a sample of a security profile selector. It's really simple. It has a predefined name current, and the controller will only watch the current security profile selector. So with the security profile selector, the switch of security profile will be very easy. You just update the selector, then you can quickly switch between security profiles. There will be a preview mode where basically you label a security profile with a special label, and the enforcers will validate the system and put the details into a status of this security profile to reflect which is going to change in the system, but actually without doing anything to the system. So that helps the class admin to get a basic idea when they want to use a security profile before the real thing happens. So between switch, there's a cleanup mechanism. The object created dynamically by the old security profile are well labeled, and they are going to be updated by the new security profile, or they are going to be removed if they are no longer needed by the new security profile. And about namespace population. So we want to allow a self-service namespace creation in certain multi-tenancy scenarios, for example, a SaaS specific multi-tenancy scenario. So people can directly use the Kubernetes API to create namespaces. The policy objects defined in the security profile will be automatically provisioned in the namespace when it gets created. So the class admin can still use additional tools to populate the policy objects, which is specific to the particular environment. For example, the users and groups, which is specific to a particular identity source, and also additional network policy rules or additional policy security policies to be used in that namespace. The security profile is going to provide a secure baseline, and additional tools can run on top of that. We also allow the heterogeneous namespaces by using namespace selector in the namespace template. So basically, we are able to provision different policies in different namespaces. So it's possible there's a one race condition when a namespace gets created, but before the policy objects are populated. So it's possible a privileged user can still access the namespace directly before it's ready. Ideally, the class level RBAC rules should be properly set up and without granting any user a permission until the namespace is populated. But if that's not the case, we are still able to use additional approaches like initializers, which hide a namespace before it gets populated. But the initializer doesn't block access; it only hides an object. Well, we are also thinking of using a validating admission webhook. During a namespace initialization, it only allows the whitelist trust controllers to populate objects, but block other users from accessing that, which may be better secure than initializers. So regarding customization and extending, so there's a few scenarios the customer may need extend or customize a security profile. For a specific reason, they want to change some rules. Then they are either copy from existing security profile and create a new custom resource, name it, alter the rules, and use kubectl apply to update the security profile selector to use their own security profile. They can also introduce the custom rules with their own custom enforcement logic. So they have to deploy the controller to enforce the rule. As the same way above, they copy from existing security profile, adding the new rules and apply that. They are also possible to replace the stock enforcement logic with existing rules. They basically deploy their own controllers and undeploy the stock controllers for the enforcement logic. About the versioning, the security profile is proposed to be maintained by the community, so people can create the reasonable security profiles to reflect the common use case. Then people can directly use in most situations. by introducing a version schema that helps people to upgrade the security profile seamlessly across different versions of Kubernetes. The version schema includes 3 parts. The first part, the name, also includes a major version, which reflects the user scenario the security profile is going to cover. And the minor version indicates the definition of rules and policy objects. So if anything changed there, the minor version will be bumped. And the last suffix version indicates basically the enforcement logic, which reflects the code of the enforcers and all the configuration related. So any upgrade in the code or fixes, improvements in the code of the enforcement controllers will bump this number. So how do we know the compatibility between the security profile with Kubernetes versions? We introduce a version matrix to be maintained in source repo of the security profiles. The version matrix is a table which maintains 3 essential columns and can be more columns, but the 3 are most important. It maps the security profile, including the version, the full version, to a Kubernetes version. And also deprecation column, which indicates this security profile should be deprecated. If a security profile can run on multiple Kubernetes versions, so there will be multiple rows to indicate the mapping. So for example, the default 1.0-1, it runs for Kubernetes 1.9, also 1.10. So there are 2 rows to indicate that. So the deployment tool will be able to figure out with current Kubernetes version which security profile should be selected and will be able to use. And about deprecation, it's very important. If a improper design or incomplete rules defined in the published security profile, that may introduce some security concerns or vulnerability in the system. So in that case, the security profile should be deprecated immediately. When a security profile is deprecated, we should explicitly mark that in the version matrix. And the tools or cluster lifecycle management will optionally have the capability to detect the deprecation from the version matrix and remind the cluster admin to upgrade security profile as soon as possible. We are thinking of adding conformance tests to validate if Kubernetes cluster satisfies the security requirement when a security profile is being deployed. But this is not, the details are not covered here. It will be a separate plan. So for configured code system, so for most configured code system, they use a single source of truth in a repository which has version control to maintain all the manifests and policy objects defined for the cluster. Basically, the security profile can be extracted into these repositories, and we will also introduce a help CLI to validate in the repository if the current object settings meets the security requirements. It can be, for example, it can check a new namespace whether there's policy object already being populated into namespaces in the code repo compared to the security profile. That will be really helpful for the class admin to be aware of all the settings, whether they are valid or not, before everything pushed to the cluster. So here are the links. If you are interested, there's links to the detailed information in the design doc and separate design doc for the configured as code system. And we are working on the prototype and demo that will come out soon. And there's other reference about background regarding multi-tenancy and policy extensibility mechanisms, kind of stuff. So that's all. Any questions?
So you talked about enforcers. Can you describe whether they're active or one-time only? So for example, you talked about bootstrapping being one of the 3 pieces of this policy. And it sounds like that probably only, the enforcer there is something related to bringing up a cluster, and it probably only runs once. And maybe that's also true for the cluster level policies, because it's kind of like you just kube control apply the cluster level policy when you install the security profile. So is it true that like the only active enforcer that's kind of running continuously is the one that is installing the default policy objects in the namespaces as they're created?
Yes. So for bootstrapping rules, yes, it's only one-time enforcement because when a class is ready, it's impossible to inspect these command line flags from inside the cluster. So it's one-time enforcement. And for the rest of the policy objects in the cluster, the enforcers is continuously watching the namespace creation and also the security profile changes. If the change happens, it will automatically enforce the policy objects into namespaces. When a security profile is switched, it will basically update the policy objects automatically across all the namespaces, matching the namespace selector.
Okay, so the triggers for it doing something actively are either creating a namespace when you have these namespace objects that get automatically populated, or switching to a new security profile. Those are like basically the two triggers for some active enforcement. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
So that was a lot. It does seem like there are about 4 or 5 different concepts and proposals within this one thing. So there's conversations about installers having to start understanding new configuration, like APIs, controllers that you would deploy that would allow you to use templated types. And then there was some stuff about conformance. And does this seem like these should be could be very different proposals and shouldn't all be linked so tightly?
Thanks. In my opinion, so security profile is the position of security profile is going to define a baseline or say a commonly used or standardized settings for the rest of stuff. So with security profile, it's easier to introduce the conformance test, which can validate, say, oh, this cluster is actually meet this security profile. And additional tools, other tools like the cluster deployment tools, which also have, how to say, a baseline of rules, or say the instructions which can deploy the cluster in a way comply to the security profile.
But what if I have an installer that is using something like Terraform or Ansible and can't parse that? Like there seems to be, if this entire proposal is dependent on every installer being able to take this as input to create a conformant cluster, that alone seems like a very large proposal.
Well, I think this is probably a reaction to the fact that to do policy in a comprehensive way, you do have to manage all these different areas, startup options and cluster level policy and namespace policy. And so if the flags that you have to set on the various components and the cluster level objects and the namespace objects are defined kind of coherently, then it would be useful for those artifacts to be able to be used individually, right? Like you say, if my installer doesn't support consuming this, it's still useful for me to know, well, to conform with the security profile, I need to set these flags on these components and then load this cluster policy and then run this namespace controller. So it seems like the pieces are still useful, and having them gathered together to say, for this policy to be effective, you actually do have to start your API server with this flag and your kubelet with this flag. Whether in your particular use case, your installer is going to do that automatically, or whether you're going to be sort of copying the flags into your Terraform setup. I like the way that it gathers all three of those levels together. It would be nice to be able to see the artifacts be usable individually. So the cluster policy and the namespace policy. You said this isn't a templater, but can you get the resources just as like a V1 list that you could pass to kubectl apply within a namespace or cluster level?
Yeah, so for cluster level, these policy objects are just defined in the plain YAML file, the manifest file. So you can directly use kubectl apply to install these.
Okay.
You can also put these manifest file into add-on managers to be automatically populated into the cluster.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I just wanted to, oh, go ahead. Sorry, Jordan.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
I just want to make a couple comments because I've talked to Yusui about this, and so I wanted to respond to kind of a couple of things that Eric said. So, and also Jordan. So I think I definitely agree that it's important that these pieces be usable independently. I mean, I think there's different levels to which you can use it. One is you can just look at the definition. I mean, like Yusui said, part of the idea is to have these like community curated small set of standard profiles. And if you want to just look at those and copy them and paste them into whatever system you're using for operations, just having those standard definitions of what is a secure cluster, or what is a cluster that has strong multi-tenancy isolation, things like that, that's useful. Another piece is that I definitely think like for the config as code part that Yusui talked about, the assumption there is, I think, if I understood correctly, that the cluster is already running, and then you're just adding the cluster level policies and the namespace level policies. And so I think that's an example where it's already expected that you can't do all three. Like you can't necessarily do the bootstrapping piece from your config as code system if that is being used for just the policies once the cluster is running. So I definitely agree that it's important that these pieces be usable independently, and also have different I hate this word enforcers because I think it gives the wrong impression, and like that there's some complicated active reconciliation going on here, but like whatever is reading these policies should be pluggable. So for example, if you want to use the cluster API to bring up your cluster, then if it understands security profiles, that's fine, even if we don't have like an adapter for Terraform yet. And then later, somebody writes something for Terraform that understands security profiles. So I think that the combination of the pluggability of these enforcers and the ability to use individual pieces of just one or two of the three pieces of the security profile make it pretty flexible, so we don't have to kind of boil the ocean all at once.
Yeah, I like the documentation as code or code as documentation aspect as well. Like rather than having a white paper that says you should definitely use these flags and these objects, like have something that documents that can be consumable by installers and things that they set up the cluster.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I think that second slide we had is really great, like the 12 screenshots from the web, where it's like that's what people are doing today. Right? They Google like how do I set up a secure cluster, and they get these 12 different blog posts and have to figure out like what to do. So I think just having these definitions, even without the enforcement mechanism, although I think the enforcement stuff is important, but even just having the definitions is, as like you said, as code is an important piece of this.
Yeah, I think a lot of installers end up with their own opinionated profile of security features. So if you're something like COPS, you sort of make some choices about which features and how you're going to set things up, and that ends up not appropriate for every use case. So having these profiles as code where you can bring into your installer and have your installer support more use cases and just be able to talk about these profiles across multiple installers feels like a big deal to me.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Mike, I think you're up next with the service account token volume.
Yeah, I just wanted to give an update on how the SIG storage meeting went. So I presented the token volume projection in SIG storage, and since then, I have gotten approval from SIG storage. And yeah, so needless to say, the presentation went well and nobody had strong objections. The last piece that is a little bit up in the air is how to ACL config maps. The current document states that we will add a namespace field to the current config map projection and figure out hard code a rule that allows access to a config map in the kube public namespace, which is used elsewhere, but not necessarily in this way. And with the eventual goal to support cross namespace config map references and to figure out the ACL story for that. So that's a little bit of a cop out. The PR or the design proposal needs one LGTM from SIG Auth to merge. That config map piece is a little weak. I think the rest of the design doc is pretty solid, but feel free to review and tell me if I got anything wrong. Yeah, that's the status update. I'll probably poke somebody this week to figure out how to proceed. Potentially, we might want to pull the config map piece out of there and continue to iterate on that design and get the APIs for the volume projection moving forward. Yeah. The service count volume projection. So, yep, that's all I want to say on it.
Okay, thanks. And just to call out a couple of the other designs, the node restriction labels and I think it was just labels and taints at this point. That design was mentioned in a previous meeting. There were some updates there, and I think that is getting close. We're talking through a couple of the last bits around defaulting, whether we can default to enforcing or not, and how we manage sort of transitioning into this tighter, more enforced world. But if you're interested in that, you can find the links in the previous minutes. Okay, well, let's get to the discussion. Last time we mentioned the governance proposal for SIG Auth. So this is, just to recap, this is describing how we want to run the SIG. A lot of that has been sort of ad hoc or tribal knowledge or yeah, just whatever happened. And there's an effort to kind of make those more well-defined. So defining roles and defining how we run things. So the RFC was open. There weren't actually, I don't think, any comments, but we said we would talk about it this week. So that is what we're going to do now. So just to give an overview, this follows the short form template that the steering committee came up with fairly closely. We tweaked a few things, but and I think Tim gave a link to the short form so you can see the diff. But generally speaking, there are kind of three leadership roles: chairs, who help run processes, meetings, cross T's, dot I's, interface with product management, SIG release, technical leads, which help drive technical priorities, make technical decisions, serve as an escalation path for things within subprojects of the SIG, and kind of ensure a consistent and coherent approach across the subprojects and among other SIGs for technical issues. And then subproject owners, and many of the subproject owners will also be technical leads, but depending on how many subprojects we have, it's possible that there will be people leading subprojects that are not up at the technical lead level, just to kind of keep a reasonable number of people, cooks in the kitchen, people driving the ship. But so this kind of lays out what the scope and responsibility and expectations are, where the responsibilities lie, what's involved in each of these, and roughly kind of the number expected at each level. So I think we called out three chairs, 3 to 7 tech leads, and then for a given subproject, 1 to 3 people kind of driving that, being responsible for it. So before we move on to some of the subproject stuff, were there comments that people had? Did people have a chance to take a look at this, or have you been tracking some of the stuff from the steering committee or this in particular?
Hey, so I briefly just took a look at this, and I thought it was interesting. So one of the things, the differences I noted was like in the steering committee version, it's kind of like tech lead was almost like just CRUD on subproject, and so it was like optional. I'm just curious about the thinking. Like, so it seems like we're going to take a more tech lead is still more of a thing, because it sort of seemed like the steering committee was like mostly doing away with tech leads and making kind of sub-project leads the thing with some organization at the chair level. Did we think that the tech lead kind of more like it is now? It looks like we're going to keep that structure, or?
So I will attempt to summarize, and then Tim and Eric can chime in as well. The thought was we don't know what subprojects or what's going to happen with subprojects. Like if we end up having 10 or 15 or 20 subprojects, taking the union of all subproject owners as the body that makes technical decisions, or that technical decisions kind of get escalated to, seemed like it could become unmanageable.
Yeah, that sounds horrible. Yeah.
What we are expecting to happen short term, at least, is that a lot of the people driving subprojects are the same people who are going to be tech leads. But we kind of wanted to think through like what the differences between those two roles would be, so that if we got to the point where we have so many subprojects and subproject owners, we do want to start trimming down that group. We aren't trying to come up with the roles then. Like if we recognize like these are two different responsibilities, kind of holistic overview of the area versus managing a roadmap for a particular subproject. They are different roles. I expect a lot of them to be shared by the same people initially, and maybe even for a while. But we wanted to recognize that they are distinct out of the gate.
Jordan, hi, this is Dan Shaw from the proposed SAFE working group of the CNCF. We're actually looking at using. We're tasked with bringing our own governance, and since the Kubernetes governance is so well defined, we're actually doing it as well. So happy to take the discussion offline if there's other items that we need to get to. But I was just curious. We were looking at subprojects and kind of deciding to not elect to sort of go there until we had subprojects. And I was wondering if you already had identified the possibility of subprojects and why you'd chosen to incorporate that.
Yeah. So. That we were hoping to have a doc out for review. I think there's actually a Google Doc that is shared with everyone, but it hadn't made it into a pull request yet, where we are kind of taking all the various areas that the SIG is working on and organizing them and figuring out who has been driving those, who has kind of the vision roadmap in their head. And so if I can, did you link to the subprojects doc, Tim or Eric?
There's the one that is actually listing out the subprojects, and then there's the one that we were working on defining the governance of subprojects.
Yeah, Dan. So this is this was kind of our working doc for the various areas. So we had one around policy management,
Got it.
one around audit work, one around node isolation, encryption stuff. There were a couple kind of slushy ones like documentation and security conformance, authenticators and authorizers. So those were kind of big buckets that have kind of distinct concerns and distinct roadmaps, and obviously there's overlap and it's useful for one area to be informed by another, but that is kind of the level of granularity we were looking at for sub-projects.
Makes sense.
And so like for the SAFE working group, something like that, like the extent to which SIG Auth would interact with that would probably be related to some of the security conformance sub-project. Same for the security profile stuff. Like that would be a good integration point to coordinate those. So
great. Thanks for the context. Yeah. Appreciate it.
Hey, Jordan, this is JJ. Yeah, Dan, we had a brief chat with Jordan yesterday too, so we can sync up on that a little later.
Fantastic.
Yep. Tim, Eric, did you have anything you wanted to add to my summarization of the governance stuff, or were there any other comments from anyone else?
I think you mostly covered everything. I think the piece that's missing from this right now is kind of the definition of sub-projects and the scoping of those, which is what we were working on and didn't really get out in time for this meeting. I'm not sure, I haven't kind of seen what all of the other SIGs are doing, but there's sort of two different approaches we could take to sub-projects. One would be like every little contained chunk of code, in which case, you know, in the authorizers, we might break out every authorizer plugin as a sub-project. But we've elected to take sort of a higher level, like area-driven approach. And so we have lumped all of the authorizers into a single sub-project, and we're being a little more conservative about how we define sub-projects. But you know, if any of those areas end up growing into a larger effort, then they could be broken out. So it's not a cut and dry definition there.
Yeah, I think the things that we want to emphasize are this is not written in stone. The goal of this is not to like calcify our process. It's just to make it clear what our process is, and if that needs to change in the future, because it's not working, or because it's too heavyweight, or it's not clear enough, or like Tim said, like an area grows and, you know, we've got 6 people doing 5 different things inside one sub-project. Well, you know, maybe we could break it apart and when it's warranted, get more granular. But we want to be clear without kind of getting bureaucratic and overwhelming and really heavyweight. So we tried to call that out a little bit. So we recognize that some of these sub-project areas, you know, they are ongoing in that they might need to react to changes or update tests or update documentation or something, but there's not a lot of work actually going on. Like they reach GA status and they function, and that's fine. And then other areas are being actively developed and are going through alpha, beta, GA cycles and changing release to release. And so we try to recognize that distinction exists and kind of set expectations for like if you're being actively developed, you're going to be identifying what progress you're going to make in each release. If you're more in maintenance mode, then you're watching your tests and making sure that you keep your thing working, reacting to new features, but you know, you don't need a roadmap doc every release.
I would also say that part of the motivation for the doc that Jordan was showing off and is linked in our meeting notes is just to also get our initial documentation about what all the issues are, who potentially owns them, where we need owners, where there are things we agreed we want but haven't had time to get around to. So for anyone that is interested in picking up work, I expect that doc to not be 100% up to date, but hopefully anyone here who is considering contributing, that would be a good starting place just to get a grasp of what we are working on, who you would bug to go work on it if you wanted to or contribute. So that is a slight motivation of that document, even though it's not explicitly written there.
Yeah. And so in addition to those three leadership roles, chair, tech lead, and sub-project owner, there's also like a better defined notion of a member. So the idea is that SIGs are self-governing, and this kind of makes explicit what happens when there's disagreement, or how you handle disagreement, instead of just looking at each other and going, well, we've always agreed up until now. I don't know what to do now. This calls out for some of the leadership positions, like this should be supported by a majority of members, and we can do it by lazy consensus, and that works, 99% of the time. But if there's disagreement, like we need to know what we should do. And so part of that is actually identifying who are the members of SIG Auth. And this is, again, taken from, guidelines are taken from what came from the steering committee. But the idea is that the people who are contributing to the area, the people who are doing work, who are adding value, who are stakeholders, have ownership of the SIG. And so for Kubernetes, that manifests in being a reviewer, being an approver, contributing pull requests, adding documentation, writing documentation, fixing bugs, fixing flaky tests, helping in the area. And so that currently manifests with like owners files. And it's possible we will need to add new ways to track some of the other artifacts like documentation and contributing on designs and things. But that is part of this as well, so that if the need for a vote comes up, and hopefully it won't often. I mean, this is a good group to work with. We talk through things and try to solve problems in a agreeable, reasonable way. But if the need for votes arises, this kind of lays out how we would figure out who's a member of the SIG. So this is the kind of thing that you hope to never need some of this, but if you need it, you'll be really glad you had it spelled out. So I would encourage people to take a look at this. I think we'll leave this open for comments for a few more days, and then probably send out a final call for like comments, and then get this in. Tim, did we also want to commit? Oh, go ahead.
Just to reiterate what you mentioned earlier, like once this gets merged, that's not a final thing. Like we'll welcome pull requests and suggestions to change it in the future as needed.
So this is kind of the first step, like the governance step. The second step is going to be identifying the sub-projects and the people who are currently running them. And in this bootstrapping step, a lot of this is really just describing the current state, like what are we doing and who is doing it. And so getting that written down is going to be helpful in a lot of ways. It tells us who to go out to ask questions, and it tells people who are interested in contributing who to talk to. And if someone is seen as being responsible for a subproject and they don't think they are, well, it'll be really clear because we put your name by something and you don't think you're responsible for it, and that means we need to find someone else to be responsible for it. So it's just going to be good to get this stuff written down and ironed out. So like I said, we have that in a Google Doc, and we will get that in a PR as well, and then send that out to the list. All right. Are there any other comments on either of these topics before we move on?
No, I just wanted to say thanks. I think it's really great.
So How do we intend to make progress since there were no objections? Let people act on the PR for a day or two and then merge it.
Yeah, I think we'll do the lazy consensus thing. So we'll announce to the mailing list. Here's the proposal. Been out for 2 weeks. Minimal comments. Lazy consensus probably by Friday or next Monday, something like that. All right. Tim, you got 5 minutes if you want to talk about the node level thing.
Yeah, I don't know that we're going to solve this in the next 5 minutes or even the next 2 weeks. I just wanted to kind of highlight that I see this as a kind of a growing area of concern. There's a lot of these sort of node scoped plugins that are popping up. And as we kind of focus on scoping down what the kubelet can do, the more plugins that are getting added on the node that do things like manipulate the node spec and pull secrets and whatnot, those are more ways that you can kind of just bypass all of the node authorization. That's kind of one piece of it that Mike responded to below. But then there's just the kind of more general problem of, I want to deploy a daemon set. It needs like, mutual TLS or something like that to some, centralized master component, not master in the Kubernetes sense, but, for instance, I just had a conversation the other day about device metrics, where they're thinking about how to expose extended metrics for device plugins. And they want to have a way of, probably a pull approach. So you have some sort of centralized, maybe Prometheus component that is scraping all of the device plugin metric endpoints. And how can we do that in a way where you can't spoof metrics of other plugins, or if you're running in the cluster as a multi-tenant service, you can't use those metrics to scrape metadata about other workloads in the cluster. And so I'm concerned that each plugin is kind of doing this in a different, somewhat incomplete way. I think in the general case, we've sort of said, use some kind of additional component on top of Kubernetes to, secure service-to-service communication. But I'm worried that for core components or things that we're expecting to be installed on a lot of clusters without those service meshes, I'm not sure we want the answer to just be like, well, if you really care about this thing being secured, then you need a service mesh to do that. Is there any kind of comments on that?
DJ and I have talked about this a couple times, and I think that it is easier to do for Kubernetes objects in core, and it's going to be very difficult to solve for CRDs and aggregated APIs. I think it would be good to start with a list of questions you would want to ask the authorizer. A couple strawmen that we've come up with is some sort of ABAC or potentially taking the intersection between the node authorizer and an RBAC rule. So you could say that this pod running as a daemon set on this node is allowed to take this action if both the node authorizer says yes, where you just treat it like the node, and it has RBAC permission to update, for example, persistent volumes. So those were our two straw men. I think this becomes quite complicated very quickly. And if doing field-based authorization is going to, I don't think we're ever going to solve that outside of custom admission. Is it really problematic for people to build domain-specific authorizers in the short term until we've solved this?
Do you really mean authorization here? It sounds like there's the problem of authorization, but then there's just the general like RBAC or policy conformance or whatever, that those are separate things.
I mean, it's predicated on knowing the node, so that's
for sure.
your pull, Mike. That adds it into extra info, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a gradient of solutions from like full-fledged ABAC with a OPA style evaluative policy that gets everything versus a just like simple bespoke node authorizer like what we have today. And me and Mike were talking about like what would actually be useful to users? Like, is there some general concept of link to this node that we could expose either through RBAC or through, I don't know, something else?
This is where a list of questions gets useful.
I think Tim's thing did a good job of laying out some of them. It's interesting because me and Mike independently started talking about this without talking to Tim.
Yesterday.
Yeah. All right. Well, for those who are actually connected, and I can think of a couple more use cases. Is the CSI, some of the CSI stuff is going to be running inside daemon sets as well.
Yeah, please, if you kind of can add more use cases, questions to this issue, that can kind of at least seed the discussion there.
And if you want to point people to this issue who you encounter, it'd be good to gather thoughts here and communicate here and try to see if there's a general pattern we can solve.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thanks for bringing that up, Tim.
Yep.
Well, that is all for today. We will send out the probably start the lazy consensus call on the governance proposal, and then send out the announcement of the subproject PR that enumerates the ones we've gathered so far and the people we've identified so far. And we'll probably consider that the nomination to be subproject owner, and people can accept or decline, I guess, if they want to comment on the PR. But yeah, we'll go from there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.